Rabbi Gottleib. Thank you so much for joining us.
Short and sweet. Well, I understand the announced topic was finding meaning in today's world. I'm going to take the prerogative of being the speaker to satisfy my own proclivities in this area, since I was trained in philosophy. Before we talk about finding meaning in today's world, what is meaning? What exactly is meaning? What kind of thing is meaning? Where is meaning found, and how? What gives anything meaning? It makes it meaningful. Let me give you some simple, trivial examples to build what I think meaning really is. I don't know if you are familiar with Greek mythology, and if you aren't, I don't recommend it. But there is a famous myth of Sisyphus who did something wrong. And the gods condemned him to roll a giant boulder up a mountain, and when he got it up to the top, it rolled back down to the bottom. And then he had to roll it up again, and then it rolled down to the bottom. He's condemned to do that forever. I think the horror in that picture is not just that it's a lot of hard work, but it's going nowhere. It's not accomplishing anything. People aren't horrified by hard work if it builds something, if it creates something. Now, there's another parable, I don't know where this came from, but I think it's very meaningful. The king said to one of his subjects, I have something I need you to do. Takes him into a room, and there's a long pole that goes out a hole in the wall. And he says, I want you to rotate this pole. Picks it up, starts to rotate it. It's heavy. It's quite difficult. The king says, that's what I need you to do. Rotate that pole. Okay, the king said so. A year goes by. 2 years go by. And the king says, well, you're doing a very good job. I appreciate what you're doing. The fellow says to the king one morning, you know, could I go outside and look on the other side of the wall and see what it is I'm doing? Maybe I'm milling wheat, to make flour, or so the king says, sure. He goes around the outside. On the outside, the other end of the pole is attached to a big, heavy stone. And when he rotates the pole, the stone goes up and down. He says to the king, I've been doing this for 2 years. The stone's going up and down. What does that do? The king said, look in the mirror. Look at yourself. Look at your muscles. Look at your strength. That's what we were building. I wasn't doing anything with the stone outside. I was building you. All of a sudden we said, oh, now I understand. Because it had a goal. It contributed to something. It built something. That's what made it meaningful. Otherwise, it would have been the myth of Sisyphus all over again. Just rotating the roll, lifting the stone, going up and down. It's meaningless. Now let me give you a Jewish example. This I heard many, many years ago in the 70s when I was living in Baltimore. A traveler from Tzfas stayed in our house for a few days. And he told me many things, but I only remember one. The word Yisrael. If you look at the letters in the word Yisrael, you have a letter for each of the Avos and the Imahos, the patriarchs and the matriarchs. The Yud stands for Yitzchak and Yaakov. The Sin is Sarah. The Reish is Rivka and Rachel. Aleph is Avram, and the Lamed is Leah. So, I thought to myself, wow, the name of our nation contains within it a reference to the 7 pillars on which the nation stands, the 3 patriarchs and the 4 matriarchs. All of a sudden, that word is much more meaningful. That word is more meaningful because it's now connected to the patriarchs and matriarchs in a way that I didn't appreciate before. I think that is, as a symptom or symbol of what meaning is. Meaning is a matter of connections. The more connected something is, the more meaningful it is. Let me give you a string of examples from everyday life. Your choice of breakfast cereal. Your choice of place to go out to eat for supper. Your choice of where to spend summer vacation. Your choice of where to go to get an education, go to university, or graduate school. Think of receiving a degree. Why is the choice of breakfast cereal less significant than the choice of place to eat out for supper? Because the choice of breakfast cereal is a choice that you make in 30 seconds, and you eat breakfast, and by the time you're out the door on the way to work, you don't remember it anymore. It's atomic. It's isolated as an event. Choice of where to go out to supper. I can't speak for everybody, but for most people, you think about it. You think, where do you want to go? What kind of food do you want to have? How much is it going to cost? When will be a convenient time for the other people who are coming along? So you may think about it for 15 or 20 minutes, and then you have to go to the place, and you spend hours there, and then you come back. It's got a longer time span of connection. Choice of summer vacation. You may think about it for months. And then you participate in the summer vacation, and afterwards, well, in my time, you were telling people about it. Now you're instantly uploading your selfies onto your website and to your Facebook page while you're doing it. And then when you come back, you're talking to people about it for months. The summer vacation is linked to maybe 6 months of consciousness and activity. So it's much more meaningful. A university degree, you spend 4 years or 3 years, depending upon your educational system, in working for the degree. And then that degree is a stepping stone to the next stage of development and educational and financial progress. That's what makes it very meaningful. In that respect, getting married could be thought of as the second most meaningful decision that a person will make in life. Because from the age of 20 anyway, people are conscious of marriage. They're conscious of the fact of marriage. They're thinking about their own plans, about when they would like to get married, and they're sensible people. They're also thinking about their own development. What kind of person do they want to become? What kind of person do they want to share their lives with? As I tell the boys in the yeshiva, when I want to motivate them to spend more time studying Torah, I say, first of all, tell me, what kind of woman do you want to marry? Let me give a description. I say, ask yourself, what kind of man does she want to marry? And then realize you have to make yourself into the kind of man that the kind of woman you want to marry wants to marry. And if you don't do that, you're shooting yourself in the foot. Stay another year in yeshiva. You'll then be much more desirable for the kind of woman you want to marry. Meaningfulness is a matter of connections. The more connected an event is, a thing is, an experience is, the more meaningful it's going to be. Now comes a sharp divide, a crucial sharp divide. Is meaning just subjective? Is it how many connections I think of and I experience, I have in mind? Or is meaning objective? Is meaning a matter of real connections? Not imagined connections, but real connections. Let me give you a brutal example of this. Viktor Frankl, who went through the death camps in Europe, he was a psychiatrist before he was incarcerated by the Nazis. And after the war, he invented a school of psychotherapy, which is either called existentialist therapy or logotherapy, the premise of which is that man has a need for meaning. People. One mustn't say man anymore. People have a need for meaning. And if that need isn't satisfied, then something stultifies, something is stunted and doesn't develop appropriately, and it can even affect your ability for survival. So, for example, he tells a story that in the death camps, he met a man who believed that the strength and fortitude that this man would display in trying to survive under the Nazis would help his brother, who was also in a Nazi camp 200 miles away, this man's strength and fortitude would help his brother survive. That's what he believed. And because he believed that, he was stronger. He was stronger, more resolute, and either survived altogether or survived longer. Another example of meaning that he mentioned, the book is called Man's Search for Meaning. Another example he has there is of a woman who was dying in the hospital, and her last few days were made more bearable by the dialogue that she had with the tree outside her window. Dialogue, not monologue. Now, when I read these examples, I thought to myself, but these are fantasies. It isn't true that the way this fellow bears his suffering here is going to increase the probability that his brother 200 miles away is going to survive. It isn't true that the tree was answering the woman when she spoke to the tree. The examples of meaning that Frankl gave were subjective, totally subjective. And I have said this in my shiurim in Or Somayach for decades. Once, a fellow came up to me after the shiur and he said, I want you to know, I have a relative who actually met Frankl, I think it was 1989, and he asked him this question. The examples of meaning that you give are subjective examples. And Frankl said, you're right. I'm a psychotherapist. My job is to help people live better, to help them cope, to help them flourish. What difference does it make to me whether it's true or false? If this idea in their minds relieves them of anxieties and helps them deal with their phobias and enables them to be more connected and more focused, makes no difference to me whether it's true or false. Now, I was, on the one hand, encouraged to hear that he was philosophically clear enough to understand the distinction and knew exactly what he was doing. But I thought to myself, I think there's an essential element missing, because this appeal to meaning is essentially one that's detaching a person from the world. He's not in the real world. Ludwig Wittgenstein was a famous philosopher in the mid-20th century. That's where I'm from, mid-20th century. Some of you are as well, I guess. And he wrote a short essay on psychotherapy. And he said one technique of psychotherapy is to take people back to their childhoods, to recover memory of a suppressed traumatic event, and enable them to articulate it and to reconcile themselves to it. In that way, free themselves from the unconscious domination of that traumatic event. Wittgenstein asked, did anybody ever do a survey of these people who now have reconciled themselves to that event and are psychologically whole and functional, whether the recalled event ever really happened? That it really happened? Maybe it didn't really happen. Maybe the psychologist is, through his artful questioning and his eyebrow raising and so forth and so on, nudging the person into a false memory, a fantasy, which will enable the person to live with himself. Perhaps he's weighed down by guilt for something, or he's got some irrational fear, and he feels crippled and deficient because of this failing. If you can project for him a false history, where the reason he has this fear or this failing is because someone victimized him. It's not his fault. He's a victim. And then he can release himself from the guilt, and he can say, well, okay, so I was just an unfortunate victim, but it's not because I'm deficient or I'm lacking or something wrong with me. I was taken advantage of. Then he can release himself, and then he can heal himself. And maybe that's why the therapy is successful. Not because you are recovering real traumatic events which were repressed, but because you are implanting a fantasy traumatic event which makes the person's present condition more bearable and able to deal with in a constructive way. These are examples of imagined, fantasized meaning. Now, the first remark that I want to make is this. I don't think that a person can use meaning or benefit from meaning if he knows that it's fantasized. He's got to believe that it's real. The psychologist may say, I'm projecting it, and he will accept this fantasy as real, and therefore he'll be healed. But he can't realize that it's fantasized. So then, if I'm looking for meaning in life, I'm not going to be able to look for a fantasy. If I know it's a fantasy, it can't be meaningful for me. I have certain people that I know are very far out on the left wing of the political spectrum, and one of the activities that is popular in the age of new age spirituality is worshiping goddesses. That's totally unfair that God is male. Where do women get their chance to express themselves? I mean, of course, from our point of view, God isn't male, God isn't female, God is beyond gender, and all, but leave that aside. I mean, they're not dealing in our context. It's totally unfair. If you worship goddesses, then the female side has an equal opportunity for expression. Yes, but can you elect to worship goddesses in order to promote equal treatment of women? But then you know they're not real. They're not true. How can you worship something that you know you made up for a political purpose? Meaning, for the person who's going to experience the meaning, has to be something that he can take seriously as real. That's why I think, from a Jewish point of view, a meaningful idea, experience, event, object, meaningfulness is a matter of connections, but real connections, not fantasized connections, and not mistaken connections. And that's what you have to look for in terms of meaningfulness. Now, I want to give you an example. The rabbi did not put me up to this, and this is not an appeal, but he gave me a tour yesterday of the magnificent shul, synagogue that is being constructed. I think it's obvious to everyone that perhaps the chief element in making it meaningful is that it's the reconstruction of a shul that the Nazis destroyed. It's not just gorgeous architecture. It's not just magnificent spirit in the way in which it's constructed, but it's a replacement for something that was destroyed by the enemies of the Jewish people. It's a symbol of the eternity of the Jewish people, of the future of the Jewish people. That makes the edifice much more meaningful because it's much more connected. That's the example of meaningfulness that we're talking about. There's a Hasidic story of a Rebbe who was traveling in a wagon in Europe, maybe 150 years ago, 200 years ago, and on his way he heard a non-Jewish shepherd singing a song, tune. Told the wagon driver to stop, and he sat there, was listening to the shepherd singing. Told the wagon driver, called the shepherd over. Called him over, and he said to the shepherd, I'm moved by the song you're singing. I think it's very beautiful. Would you teach it to me? So make sure that I get it right. He said, sure. So he sings it through, and the Rebbe sings it through several times, and then finally the Rebbe gives a fine rendition, and the shepherd says, you've got it 100%. The Rebbe says, you've been very kind and very helpful to me. I have one more favor to ask you. Just sing it for me one more time. And the shepherd forgot the tune. Forgot it. Couldn't sing it. It was gone. Ah, said the Rebbe, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I appreciate what you've done. And drives on. So the wagon driver says to the Rebbe, what happened? He taught it to you. And then he forgot it? Said the Rebbe, I heard that song, and I heard in that music from the temple. The temple which was destroyed 1,700 years before. I heard music from the temple. That's what I heard. But I had to make sure. How could I be sure that it really came from the temple? I didn't hear any music from the temple. I just heard in it that that's where it came from. So I decided to test. I got him to teach it to me. If it's music from the temple, why is he singing it when I'm driving along? He's singing it because it's got to come back to us. It has to come back to us. Here's my test. He taught it to me. When I learned it, he forgot it. That's right. He forgot it. Because his only purpose in knowing it and singing it was that it had to come back to us. Once it fulfilled that purpose, he forgot it. That was my test, that it really came from the temple. So now, that music is music. And music moves a person, enables a person to express himself. Now you say, yeah, but this music is 1,700 years old. They used it in the temple to accompany the sacrifices. That gives it an entirely different meaning, has an entirely different significance, because it's connected in that way. I was not brought up religious, and on my way in, I had a lot of contact with Abram Horowitz, who was my Rebbe's nephew. Very intelligent, well-trained, philosophical person. And on my way in, I don't think I was fully committed yet. He said to me, and of course, it's Hasidic fellow, with the funny hats and the long black coats. You've read about them in history books. They're probably extinct, right? He said to me, my goal in life is that my children should look like my parents. I thought, what? Your goal in life is that clothes styles shouldn't change? You should still be wearing the same clothes next generation? He said, no. There's a chain. For a Jew, the chain begins with Abraham. And that chain is going to go to the Messiah. I don't want to be a broken link. I want my children to look like my parents. So I thought to myself, here's a person whose every move in life is connected to thousands of years of history. Past and hundreds of years of history, future. That's meaning, because it's connected. And because it's connected to something real. Not something that was made up or I made up, but something that's real. Other philosophies do have a connectedness to history. The communists had a picture of, they didn't have the Big Bang, but they had a picture of history, natural history, social history, political history, in particular economic history, where they felt that economics determines the whole of culture. And they had a picture of the future. After feudalism comes capitalism. After capitalism inevitably comes socialism and communism. They had a connected picture. It just wasn't real. It was a mistake. As we see, communism collapsed. And I think it's important to remember, no one, not one of the rabbinic authorities in the late 19th century signed on to communism. Not one. There's a lot of dispute and controversy among rabbinic authorities, and they take different positions on a variety of subjects, but not on this one. Not a single one signed on. Why? Because if you don't have a picture of the underlying reality, how the world really works, what's really guiding it, which is really divine providence, if you don't take that into account, then your theory perforce is superficial. Not only was it superficial, they didn't even get the superficial right. They didn't get the economics right. They didn't get the psychology right, sociology right. But for sure, if you're not going to take into account the reality that underlies it, it's going to fail. Now, this is a great tragedy because the people who originally supported communism, many of them were first-class intellectuals. They were very highly trained philosophical thinkers. Marx was no fool, although he played fast and loose with the evidence. Look at what's his name? The book's called The Intellectuals by Paul, the historian, Paul Johnson. He was not completely honest with the variables that he used. But when you get the reality wrong, so then it hasn't got any hope of being really meaningful. Now, when we think of the people who signed on, the people who dedicated their lives, the people who lost their lives, they lost their lives to bring communism into the world, how do we feel about them? Don't we feel pity for them? They gave their lives for an illusion. They experienced subjective meaning. We are the future. But they gave their lives for an illusion. And this can affect a person more or less. There is an incident which is reported in the life of Ben Gurion, that when he signed the agreement with the religious parties that yeshiva students will not fight in the army, one of his advisors said to him, "How can you do that? You're giving up a whole population for the army." He said, "You're making a mistake. In 20 years there won't be any yeshivas. Religion is dead. Socialism is taking over the world. I didn't give away anything. I made peace with these fools for now. 20 years from now they won't be here." Wasn't quite right. Yeshivas haven't disappeared. The yeshiva population in Israel from that time to now has been multiplied by 100. There are 100 times as many or more than there were at that time. Because he staked his future on a false meaning. I want to give you an example that's closer to home. You probably all heard of the Big Bang.
The TV show.
Sorry?
The TV show Big Bang?
I didn't know there was a TV show. No. Okay. The idea that the universe has a beginning has been resisted throughout history. The Orthodox view was that the world has no beginning. Even in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and 50s.
The Orthodox scientific view.
That's right. That's right. The view of the philosophers, the scientists, the Greeks, the Romans, everyone. Even when it was discovered the universe was expanding, there was a way to get around it, so the world has no beginning. It was called the steady state theory. You can look it up on Wikipedia. Now, I imagine a Jew, 1920 or 30 or 40, and he's reading Bereshis. God created the heavens and the earth in the beginning. And a modern, up-to-date, scientifically literate person says to him, "You still read that? You still believe that? You're just gone. You're just out of touch." Throughout history, the best people have always felt the world has no beginning. And today, the whole scientific community agrees the world has no beginning. And you're still reading those superstitions? You're still reading that childish stuff? Get with it. And he thinks, wow, the whole philosophical world, the whole scientific world, they're all against me. So, how can I hold on to this? Imagine in 1964, he has his first cheeseburger. In 1964, he violates his first Shabbos. At the end of 1964, he dies. What a tragedy, because in 1965, they found out that the world has a beginning. In 1965, the evidence became available that the Big Bang Theory is correct and the world does have a beginning. He gave up his life for the best theory, what all the scientists and philosophers agree upon. He gave up his Jewish life for that, for a fantasy. Because the best theory was only a hypothesis. And a hypothesis in cosmology is basically a guess. And it can be dramatically wrong. Dramatically wrong. Okay, so that was 1965. That's ancient history. What about today? What about today? How much are we sucked into the bravado, the overweening self-confidence and pride of those who will tell you that science has discovered, and of course, if it's been discovered, it's got to be true. That's what discovered means. Science has demonstrated, science has proven, science has created, and then we feel under pressure, especially social pressure. How will I explain myself to my contemporaries who are hypnotized by the latest scientific guess? How will I explain myself and hold myself up? What will my social image be if I proclaim a belief in Genesis? And then the person sucked in and may not live to see when this one goes down and the next one comes up. We have to be very conscious of the need for real meaning, not fantasized meaning, and be very conscious of the fact that what people project as real meanings may in fact, I lived, and some of you are old enough to remember this, lived through the academic fascination with communism. Many of the academics were on the side of communism. Some even made trips to Eastern Europe and came back and told us it was a paradise, the workers' paradise, and how well they were doing. Just turned out to be wrong. Just dead wrong. Okay, now let's talk in more practical terms. A person puts on tefillin in the morning. Jews have been doing that for thousands of years. And they will continue to do that until and after the Messiah comes. A person puts on tefillin in the morning should feel that he's standing in a chain. And he is, like Abram Horowitz said to me, a link in a chain. And I don't want my children to look different from my parents or grandparents or great-grandparents, depending upon particulars of each person's family, because I'm connected to something real, something that marches through time with reality. If you keep Shabbos, you know that in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, when Jews came to North America, the vast majority abandoned Shabbos because it was a 6-day week. And if you didn't come in on Saturday, on Monday we're looking for a new job. There were a few who held on. Rabbi Feinstein, Zechazah Gebracha, made a very remarkable comment about this phenomenon. He said, there are three types. There are those who lost it. Those who lost it ended up, their children became conservative Jews, and their grandchildren were Reformed Jews, and their great-grandchildren are unidentified, like 1.5 million American nominal Jews who are unidentified altogether. Then there were two types who held it. There was one type who said, Shabbos is Shabbos, I cannot give it up. Boy, it's hard to be a Jew. It's hard to be a Jew, but I have to do it. He said they too are responsible for killing a generation, because the children said, it's hard to be a Jew. Why bother? America's open. America has education. America's economy is rising, and we are reasonably accepted. There's very little anti-Semitism. Why bother? There's one family that was described at that time where every Friday night the husband came home and they sat down to a Friday night meal, and he told his children, I had a great simcha today, a great joy today. I had a great privilege today. I lost my job for Shabbos. Let's dance in honor of that simcha. And he danced around the table singing with his children, have a chance to make a sacrifice for Shabbos, have a chance to enjoy the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu enabled me to be in a position to do something really meaningful, really important for the sake of Shabbos. Every one of his children became a teacher of Torah. The idea that it's hard to be a Jew is an idea which does not receive from the meaning of being linked to the generations. When you're linked to the generations, whatever you are suffering, whatever you're giving up, whatever losses you have to take, there are periods in Jewish history in which the losses were much greater. Much greater. Do we look at them as unfortunates? It depends upon what your picture of life is. If your picture of life is the next tickle of the sensory endings in your sense organs, which gives you pleasure, then indeed you'll look at it that way. But then when you grow up and you mature, you don't see that as what's meaningful. I'll give you another example from the secular world. Einstein, when he was working on his general theory of relativity, went through 2 years of real agony. He reports it. He says, if no one who hasn't been through it can understand what it means. You have whole notebooks of his, the pages are all crossed out because they're all full of mistakes. He was struggling to make something work, and it was agonizing. When he got the breakthrough, but he didn't know there would be a breakthrough. He couldn't guarantee there would be a breakthrough. What he knew was, I'm trying to figure out how the universe works. That's important. It's important because it's connected to the past, present, and future. It's connected to understanding the reality of the world. The reality, not a fantasized meaning, but a real meaning. Every moment of a Jew's life where he has an opportunity to do a mitzvah, to study a piece of Torah, is an opportunity to be connected in that way. The proof of it is the survival of the Jewish people over the last 2,000 years, at least. I have much longer exposition of the prior period of time, but being small minorities scattered throughout the world is a condition under which no culture has survived except ours. I've had this up on the net for more than a decade. Someone wrote to me about the Romani peoples, the Gypsies. Why are you different from the Gypsies? Gypsies have been scattered for 1,000 years, small minorities, various places, North America and Europe and in North America, South America, and they still survive. So I did a little research. The Romanis have no memory of their history. They don't know who they are or where they came from. Historians opine that they came from northern India 1,000 years ago as mercenaries fighting in wars. They have no memory of their history. They have no religion. Romanis are Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, and Muslims, depending upon the country in which they live. They have fundamental differences in values. Some Romanis are against literacy, and some prize literacy. On their websites, they say you shouldn't speak of Romani culture, but Romani cultures, plural. So I said to my correspondent after I discovered this, I thanked her very much for the reference, that's what you should expect. Scattered minorities for 1,000 years lose their culture. What do they have left? A certain physical form because they marry among one another, certain dialect, and certain common superstitions. That's it. And we, in double the time, 2,000 years, maintained, let's say, 90% of our culture. That's the exception. We're part of something that's eternal, something that will not die. People say that it's hard to do controlled experiments in history. Each historical event is unique. We have the nearest thing to a controlled experiment. Judaism has survived under every conceivable condition. We had a kingdom, we had our own centralized population, our own army and wars, we had a period of exile, we had a period of recovery, we had 1,900 years of exile, in a certain sense the exile is still going on. It's a tricky point. We've lived under every different condition, and we have managed to survive. That means that we embody something that's eternal, something that's indestructible. And that being the case, every move that a Jew makes, every little detail of what he does is connected to that history and is therefore meaningful. We should live in terms of that meaning. Think about that meaning. Feel a connection when you read about Jewish history. Feel a connection to King David. Feel a connection to Hillel. We read what Hillel said, read how Hillel lived, and he inspires us today. Then he's still alive today. Part of what I am today is because of Hillel 1,900 years ago, 2,000 years ago, and so on. And that means that we have the opportunity, the Torah is an invitation to a life of maximum meaning, which means real meaning, real connection to the way the world really works. That's how to find meaning in today's world.
Thank you so much.